All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors, Shmuel and Dinovitz, for dedicating all the Shurim and Drushos this month in memory of Shmuel's father, Harav Peretz Avram Ben Rabbi Binyamin Moshe Zichron Lebracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family in Nechama. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Ira and Miriam Grossman, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drushos this week in memory of Miriam's father, Aryeh ben Moshe Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family in Nechama. With that, let us begin. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Kuf Chaf 120. We are picking up on Kuf Yotes on the base 119b at the Mishnah. The last Mishnah on the page, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 lines up from the bottom. So it's a very interesting case here. Shtei Yevamos. You have two sisters-in-law. Now again, the case over here is Rachel and Leah, not related to each other, married to two brothers, Reuven and Shimon. Okay, that's the case. Zu omeres meis ba'ali, v'zu omeres meis ba'ali. So very interesting case. Rachel comes to Beis Din. She says, my husband died. Leah comes to Beis Din, my husband died. So we'll say, so again, remember, independently, what's the halacha when Rachel comes to Beis Din and says, my husband died, and Leah makes the same claim? What's the halacha? They're believed, right? They're believed. See, here's what's interesting about this case. Zu asura mipnei baila shel zu, v'zu asura mipnei baila shel zu. So we'll say, so remember again, we are presupposing over here, so Rachel's married to Reuven, Leah is married to Shimon. Neither of them have children. Neither husband had children. So now Rachel comes to Beis Din and she says, my husband died. That's fine, we believe her. But now what's the problem? Rachel is subject to Yibum, right? To Shimon. Now Leah is coming to Beis Din and saying, my husband died, Shimon died. That frees her from, she's believed, but now she's subject to Yibum to Reuven. What's fascinating about this case, the Mishnah Bose, is each woman is believed regarding her own husband, but yet, again, their testimony does not count to free the other one from Yibum. So therefore, again, as much as Rachel is believed that her husband is dead, so Leah's testimony regarding her husband, Shimon, does not help Rachel regarding Yibum. This goes back to the idea that, remember, Yevamos, in general, sisters-in-law, are not believed to testify regarding, again, the death of the other one's husband. So therefore, the testimony of Rachel's husband does not help Leah regarding Yibum, and vice versa. Fascinating case. Fascinating case. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says, Zu asura l'shuk mipnei baila shel zu. So for example, Rachel is not permitted to marry into the general population. Ultimately, again, because of the obligation that she now has in Yibum to Shimon. Shehu Yevama, the Shema Chayhu, Uzikukolo, the Afapisha Ishto Omeres Meis. Now, even though you'll see this for 1 second, Rachel is going to be subject to Yibum to Shimon. Shimon's wife Leah is testifying that he is dead. Remember again, Leah's testimony regarding her husband is not enough to allow Rachel to marry into the general population. Because ultimately, again, a sister-in-law cannot go ahead and testify on behalf of her sister-in-law. Ultimately, because remember again, because a sister-in-law is one of the 5 women who is not permitted to testify. Fascinating case. Let's go back there. L'zu eidim or l'zu ein eidim. We'll say this is fascinating. Let's say Rachel brings witnesses to back up her claim. So Rachel comes to Beis Din. She says, my husband is dead, but she brings witnesses to go ahead and back up that claim that her husband is dead, right? But let's say Leah doesn't have witnesses, right? So watch this. L'zu eidim or l'zu ein eidim, es sheish la eidim asura, ve'es she'im la eidim muteres. So we'll say this is fascinating. So Rachel comes to Beis Din. She says, my husband is dead, and she brings witnesses. So we'll say, so now Rachel is permitted to go ahead and remarry based on her testimony. Well, I take that back. Rachel, right, is believed regarding her husband, but yet, again, not permitted to remarry. Why? Yibum. But here's what's fascinating. The fact that Rachel brought witnesses, who does that help? That helps Leah. That helps Leah, because now Leah comes to Beis and Leah testifies, my husband is dead. So regarding her husband, she's believed. She's also no longer subject to Yibum. Why not? Because Rachel brought witnesses that Ruvain, the Yavam, is dead. So therefore, again, Rachel's witnesses help Leah, because now, again, independent of Rachel's testimony, we now have objective testimony that Ruvain, Leah's Yavam, is dead, and therefore she is permitted to go and remarry. Fascinating. Lezu banim, ulezu ein banim. What happens ultimately, again, if let's say Rachel has children and Leah doesn't have children, as sheyishla banim muteres. So we'll say now, Rachel, who has kids, obviously, again, she's permitted to remarry. Why? Because remember, again, she's believed to say that her husband is dead. The presence of children ultimately precludes any need for yibum, so she's permitted to remarry. But of course, Leah, now we go back to case number one, Leah won't be permitted to remarry. Why? Because as much as Leah is believed to say that what her husband Shimon is dead, Lemaisa, again, she is still subject to yibum. Nisyabmu umeise yabmin. Another interesting case. So we'll say, let's play this out. So let's say, once again, you have Rachel and Leah. Rachel's married to Ruvain. Leah is married to Shimon. So now what happens? Each wife is coming to Beis Din saying that her husband died. So what's the halacha? The halacha is that they're believed but still subject to Yibum. Let's say there's two more brothers, Levi and Yehuda. Good. So now what happens? Levi does Yibum with Rachel and Yehuda does Yibum with Leah. Okay, that's by the way totally permitted. Now Levi and Yehuda die. Levi and Yehuda without children. So now both say, what's Rachel and Leah's status now after having done Yibum with Levi and Yehuda, but still no children? Asuros lihinase. So we'll say Tanakama says they're not permitted to get remarried. Now, why are they not permitted to get remarried? Because effectively, they are right back in the same situation as they were before, as they were prior to Yibum. Because now, after Levi and Yehuda die, Rachel and Leah are both still stuck. Because what's the status of their other respective Yavmin? In other words, we'll say, let me just play this out for just a second. Rachel's married to Ruvain. Leah's married to Shimon. Rachel comes to Beis Din, my husband died. Leah comes to Beis Din, my husband died. What's the halacha? They're both believed regarding their respective husbands. Can they remarry into the general pool? No. Why? Yibum. Okay. So now in this last case, it's fine because there's two more brothers, Levi and Yehuda. So Rachel does Yibum with Levi. Leah does Yibum with Yehuda. Fine. Now, Levi and Yehuda die without children. So now the shaila is, what's the status of Rachel and Leah? So the Tanakama says, we're right back where we were before they did Yibum. Why? Because now they're subject to Yibum again, and I will say, who don't we know, whose whereabouts are still unknown, so to speak? Ruvain and Shimon. In other words, right? So Leah still has to worry about Ruvain. Rachel still has to worry about Shimon. So ultimately, again, we're right back where we were, and ultimately they're not permitted to marry into the general pool. Rabbi Lozer says no. Rabbi Lozer says no. Once they do Yibum, ultimately again with Levi and Yehuda, essentially what we do is we close out the Ruvain and Shimon chapter of this. Once they become permitted to their Yavmin, ultimately, again, the earlier part of the story is closed. Fine. So the Gemara, look at Rashi. So Belazar essentially says, it doesn't make sense. Once we're allowing them to go ahead and marry the Yavam, Levi and Yehuda, by definition, what that does is say we accept the testimony that the husbands are dead. The chapter is closed. When Levi and Yehuda die without children, again, assuming there are no other surviving brothers that we know about, they're permitted to marry into the general pool. A fascinating Mishnah. But let's go back to Tana. Lezu edim ubanim ulezu lo edim v'lo banim shtein mutaras. So the Gemara just adds another case. Let's say Rachel has edim and sons. So we'll say, what's that case? So Rachel comes to Beis and she says, my husband died. But she also brings edim to support that. And not only that, Rachel has kids. So I will say, but Leah doesn't have Edim and doesn't have kids, what's the halacha? They're both mutaros. Everybody say, why is that? Rachel is mutaros. Why? Number one, she has Edim, right? She doesn't even need Edim, but she has Edim, right? She has her own testimony and she has kids. So she's willing to say that her husband died, no din of Yibum. Now remember again, I will say, based on this, Leah is also good to go. Why is Leah good to go? Because Lamai says she's believed to testify about the death of her husband. And remember again, Rachel's witnesses are helpful to her to ascertain that her Yavam Ruvain is dead. So this would be a situation where both women would be permitted to marry into the general pool. Incredible. Nisyabmu umesu hayavmin. So we'll say, what happens if halacha l'maisa again? So what's his last case in Mishnah? Let's say again, Rachel and Leah come to Beis Din, ultimately testify that their husbands died. They are believed. In this case, there's two more surviving brothers, Levi and Yehuda. Rachel does Yibum with Levi. Leah does Yibum with Leah. And now, Leah does Yibum with Yehuda. And now what happens? Levi and Yehuda die. So what's the halacha? Asur and Linase. Tanakama says they revert back to their previous status. Since, again, Rachel doesn't know what happened to her Yavam Shimon. Leah doesn't know what happened to her Yavam Ruvain. Therefore, they are Asuros. Rabbi Lazar says, no. Ultimately, again, once they became permitted to do Yibum, essentially what Rabbi was saying, we close out the previous narrative. So let's analyze this. My time with Rabbi Elazar. I will say, what's Rabbi Elazar's logic? Or why is that? What does Rabbi Elazar say? That once Rachel does Yibum with Levi and Leah does Yibum with Yehuda, right? We close out the previous Ruvain Shimon chapter. What's the reason for that? So the Gemara says, Mishum de kasarat Sarah mi'idul lechaverta. Is it because he holds that maybe a sister-in-law can testify on behalf of her fellow sister-in-law? Sarah, right? The potential, right? That is permitted. Or I should say even a co-wife, right? But in this case, it's Rashi says over here, the hashte Yevamos saros nenu mipnei tzad saros lo nifsuma lehad zulazu. So is it that he holds that really Rachel and Leah have the ability to testify on behalf of each other? Oh, Dilma mishum dehila mekalkala nafsha. Or maybe it's because no, at the end of the day, it was saying when Rachel testifies that her husband Reuven is dead, you see, we believe her, and we don't believe that she would testify falsely just to mess over Leah. We don't believe that. To which the Gemara says, kind of sounds like he's saying the same thing. What's the practical difference in these two approaches? It was a tap of kofchaf, the ansube litzara mikame dida. I will say, here's an afkamina. This is fascinating. Do we allow the co-wife to get married? I'll call the co-wife the sister-in-law to get married before the woman who's actually giving the testimony. If halacha l'maisa we say that a sister-in-law could give testimony on behalf of her fellow sister-in-law, even though the one going ahead and giving the testimony has not yet remarried, min sabinan le litzara will allow the other sister-in-law to get married. However, but if we say the reason we believe her is because we used to know when a woman gives testimony, she's not going to mess herself over. Therefore, if that's the case, insiv min sabinale litzara, ilo insiv lo min sabinale. So we'll say in that case over here, then the test case will be, will the woman herself get remarried? If the woman herself gets remarried based on her testimony, then we take it as truth. But if she's not getting remarried based on her testimony, we're a bit suspicious to accept it. So what's the halacha? So let's analyze. So Tashma, Rabbi Lazar Omer Hol v'chutru liyavmin chutru l'chol adam. Rabbi Lazar said in the Mishnah, once Rachel and Leah do Yibum with Levi and Yehuda, ultimately again, and Levi and Yehuda die, they're now permitted to marry into the general pool. See, here we go. If you say at the end of the day, she's not going to want to mess herself over, then I will say it makes sense. Once she marries, we could allow the sister-in-law to marry. But if it's because we allow one Sarah to go ahead and testify on behalf of her fellow Sarah, then even if she did not first marry, we would still believe her testimony. Rather, we'll say, Masir Rabbi Lazar holds that halacha l'maisa. that ultimately, again, once a woman, as much as there may be a natural animosity between sisters-in-law, halacha lamaisa, a woman is not going to mess herself over in order to go ahead and mess over her sister-in-law. Therefore, halacha lamaisa, if she marries first, that is enough to accept her testimony. Rabbi Laz, to which the Gemara says, Rabbi Lazar lidivreim ka'amralahu. It's also that Rabbi Lazar is addressing himself to the Rabbanan, to the Tanna Kama, and he'll say the following: Lididi Sarah mi'ida lechaberta. According to me, I believe that one Sarah has the ability to testify on behalf of her fellow Sarah. Va'afal gav delo insabu min sabinallah. And even if halacha lamaisa, she did not first remarry, we would allow the other sister-in-law to marry. Ela ledidachu odu limihas dehecha de insab misambinallah mishum dehi lo mekalkala nafsha. Rabbi says to Rabbanan, at least admit to me that halacha lamaisa, if the first sister-in-law married based on her own testimony, you should have certainly allowed the second sister-in-law to do so. And ultimately, the Rabbanan, Tamos nafshi implishtihi ka'avda. Both say this is the phrase we had yesterday. Tamos nafshi implishtihi both say means what? That sometimes people will do things that hurt themselves if it gives them the ability to hurt others. So therefore, the Rabbanan will say, even if halacha lemaisa, you see her marry first, that may not necessarily allow us to rely on her testimony. Incredible. So we'll say, so good. So that's the end of that sugya. So the Gemara goes weiter. So we'll say, so just before we go on, how do we paskin in that case? The Rambam paskins, Rabbi say, like the Rabbanan, namely that when Rachel and Leah, right? So Rachel's testifying about the death of her husband, Leah's testifying about the death of her husband. So Rabbi said, what we established from the Mishnah is that halacha l'maisa, each woman's testimony is believed to allow them each to remarry. But remember, each woman's testimony does not help to alleviate the yibum obligation of the other. In the last case in the Mishnah, where there are other surviving brothers, so in addition to Reuben and Shimon, there's also Levi and Yehuda. So Rachel does yibum with Levi, and Leah does yibum with Yehuda. That's permitted. If Levi and Yehuda now die without children, the Rambam paskins, we're right back where we were. And therefore, Yanabos say, meaning right back where means what? That Allah Chalamaisa, Leah, Rachel still does not know what the status of Shimon is, and Leah does not know what the status of Reuven is. And that unknown status will prevent them from marrying into the general population. So we paskin like the Rabbanan. Fascinating. So Tashma will say, let's analyze. Tashma, Ha'isha shahalchahi ubay l'medina sayam uba'a va'amra meis ba'ali. So an interesting case. Woman goes overseas, right, with her husband, and she comes back and she says, my husband died. Okay, so what's the halacha? Tinase v'titol ksuvasa v'tzara sa'asura. Shabbat say, so remember, Rachel goes overseas with her husband Reuven. Now, by the other part of the story, there's another wife, right? The other wife Leah, right? So what happens? So Rachel comes back. She says, my husband died overseas. She's believed, and she gets her ksuva. Now her co-wife, Sarah Sa'asura, right? Her co-wife, ultimately, Rachel remains Asura. Sorry, Leah remains Asura. So again, we've seen that halacha before. Because remember, the testimony of one wife does not help her co-wife. So therefore, even though we are going to allow Rachel to go ahead and remarry, ultimately, again, Leah cannot. I will say that, remember that we saw this already. That's because co-wives are one of the 5 women who are not believed to give testimony regarding each other. So Rabbi Lazar says no. Rabbi Lazar says no. Once Rachel is believed for herself, then what? She's obviously believed for her co-wife as well. So the Gemara says, I ema hoel v'hutra v'nises. Right? So the Gemara says, why don't we say over here that maybe the halacha should be that when do we believe Rachel? If Rachel herself gets remarried. So in other words, I will say, there's a difference in giving testimony and acting on that testimony. So if Rachel comes back and says, what? My husband is dead, and she gets remarried, perhaps that's when we should believe her regarding Leah, to which the Gemara says, V'leichosh Dilma begita asoy. So I'll say, listen to this. Perhaps you should also be concerned. Perhaps you should also be concerned. So the Gemara therefore says, Ema hoil, sorry, the Gemara says, Ema hoil v'hutra v'nises. So ultimately, again, the Gemara says, V'leichosh, Dilma begita asoy. Listen to this. Why are we concerned that maybe Rachel actually got a get from Ruvain? Or when they went overseas, Rachel actually got a get. So she's divorced. So if Rachel is divorced, why is Rachel coming back and saying that Reuven is dead? Why? Because she wants to give a shtach to Leah. She wants Leah to think that Leah is a widow. Leah is going to get remarried, and ultimately, she's going to give a good shtach to Leah. To which the Gemara says, "In sivli Yisrael hachinami." I will say, if Rachel would have remarried a Yisrael, then I would believe that. That would be a good claim. What's the case? How come I ask? What's the case? The insiv l'kohen. I will say the case over here in question is where Rachel comes back. Well, say here's the case. Rachel comes back. Rachel says, my husband died overseas. So what's the halacha? So she can get remarried and she collects her ksuva. Now the case, the Gemara says she did get remarried. Who did she marry? Who did she marry? A Kohen. Then I will say, if she was just trying to kind of give a shtach to Leah, then what? If she would have married a Yisrael, I would have heard that. But ultimately, if she's a divorcee, she would not have gone ahead and married a Kohen if she knew that was illegal for herself to do so, just to give it to Leah. The fact that she went ahead and she married a Kohen indicates to us, it really concretizes or solidifies the truthfulness of her claim, and therefore halacha l'maisa, we believe her to say that her husband died overseas. I will say, I'll just mention that a lot of this discussion centers on, do we let's go like this. Do we believe that people lie? Do we believe that people lie? Absolutely, right? All the time, right? All people all the time. Well, not all people all the time, right? But most of the people all the time, or at least some people all of the time, or at least some people some of the time, right? People lie. I will say, here's the interesting question about human nature. Will people lie to the point that they would actually disadvantage themselves, put themselves at a disadvantage? That's really the fundamental question. What we call in halacha, tamos nafshi implishtim, right? Would people go ahead and lie, and not only lie, by the way, but act on that lie to their own disadvantage if it also allows them to compromise someone else? That's the theme that you see going on here further and further. So I will say, so for example, that's why what we're saying over here is halacha l'maisa, will we say that if a woman gives testimony, remarries based on her own testimony, that we should allow, therefore, that testimony to work for her co-wife as well? So I will say, what does that depend on? Do we say, Tamos nafshi implishtim? Maybe Rachel is so bent on going ahead and doing something bad to Leah that not only will she lie, but she'll act on her own lie just in order to go ahead and get Leah to commit a wrong. So I will say, it's fascinating. So much of this sugya boils down to that nakuda in human nature. We know that people will lie, that we know, but will people act to their own detriment in order to hurt others? That's the fundamental machlokes. Good. I will say, now we're transitioning a little bit. So we'll say, up until now, we spent a lot of time, a significant amount of time. The truth is, the beginning of this parak and almost all of last parak, focusing on women or others giving testimony about the death of someone else. And I will say, now we're transitioning. This is a fascinating sugya, transitioning to the following: identifying what do you need in order to identify that someone has died. So the Gemara says as follows: Ein me'idin ela al pirtz of panim ha'chotim. So I will say, so now let's talk about identifying a person who's died. I will say, the halacha is that for halachic purposes, the only thing that serves as identification for a person who has died is facial recognition. Facial recognition. And what do you need for facial recognition? Even ella al pirtz panim ha'chotim. Both say you need the face together with the nose. So in order to identify a person who has died, we need an intact face with a nose. We'll say this is so even if there are other identifying marks on the person's body, right? Or for that matter, on his clothing or on his utensils. We'll say, let's say Ruvain has a birthmark, right, on his right elbow. That is not enough, says the Mishnah, in order to be able to identify a person, to be able, again, I will say, this is why are we identifying him? Why are we identifying him? Right? Because we want to know that he indeed is the dead person in front of us, again, to permit his wife to remarry and everything else. The Mishnah says identification takes place with facial recognition. And facial recognition, I will say, is the face with the nose. Not only that, you can only testify about a person who's really dead only once what? He's really dead. Otherwise, I will say, what does that mean? Well, so even if you saw a person, meguyad means like cut, right? Cut up. In other words, you saw a person with a mortal injury, or salov. We'll say salov, it's actually interesting. Salov, we translate salov as hanged, right? A person is hanged. Salov could also mean crucified. In other words, you see him, I will say a person is hanging on the gallows, that's a pretty good indication that he said, no. It's not just a pshat that you saw him hanged, but actually, again, you have to see him dead, right? The chaya ochalas a person attacked by a wild animal. So again, halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah is saying is, you might have thought, you see a person being attacked by a wild animal, and what do you say to yourself? There's no way he survived that. Or you see a person, chas v'shalom, stabbed by a sword. No way he survived that. You see him on the gallows and they kick out the bench from under him. No way that he survived that. The Mishnah says, we saw this already before, circumstantial evidence is not enough. You have to see him dead in order to testify. So the Gemara said furthermore, in the Eden ella ad gimel yomim, halacha l'maisa, we're only allowed to testify about the death of a person up to 3 days. They will say, well, now what does this mean? This is the assumption that after 3 days, the body becomes disfigured. So the point, again, because of decay, because of bloating, so ultimately, again, after 3 days, even facial recognition apparently is not going to work. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, lo kala adam v'lo kala makom v'lo kala shal shavim. Rabbi Yehuda says, the truth is, this halacha is really dependent. Each case is different. He will say, what is it going to depend on? Where did you find the body? How did you define the body? What's the temperature in the area that you found the body? Dry land versus water. There's so many different circumstances over here. So halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Yehuda says you can't make a blanket halacha in this scenario. So we'll say, let's analyze this halacha. So we'll say the first halacha that we're going to focus on is the Mishnah said facial recognition. Right? The only way to identify a person ultimately, again, is through facial recognition. And what's facial recognition? The face and the nose. Tanrabanon, padachas v'lo pirtz panim, pirtz panim v'lo padachas, in me'idin olav achu shneim imachotem. So we'll say now the Brisa adds in one more thing. What's facial recognition? Forehead, nose, face. Forehead, nose, face. If you, I will say, I'm really. The Gemara is calling it 2 things, but we're going to just break it down into 3 things. So forehead, nose, face. That is what is required for facial recognition. If you're missing any part of that, then halacha l'maisa, that is not enough to identify the body. Mikra, what's the passage that supports this? Hakaras pneim on sabam. So we'll say the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Yeshaya, which literally hakaras pneim, recognition of their face testified against them. So therefore, again, the Gemara is using this facial recognition is what is needed to ascertain something in halacha. So the Gemara says as follows: Abba bar Marta, the Hava Abba bar Minyumi, Hava Maski Beirish Koser. Well, so the Gemara tells an interesting story here. Right, Abba bar Marta, who was also Abba Minyuma, borrowed money from the Reish Galusa. He owed them money. So we'll say what happens. So he wanted to avoid his creditors. So what did he do? I see Kira, Davak Bivavlisa, Davak Bafusya. So we'll say what did he do? He took a little bit of wax, attached it to a shmata, and put the shmata on his forehead. Chalav kamai velo bashkura. So we'll say what happened? And he passed right in front of them, and they did not recognize him. What's the point of the story? The point of the story is what makes your facial recognition is your forehead, your nose, and your face. He covered his forehead. Once he covered his forehead, apparently what? They did not go ahead and recognize him. Okay, good. To which the Gemara says, "Afal pi sheish siman." And I both say, now the interesting part of this Mishnah is the Mishnah says, in order to identify that a person has truly died, you need facial recognition, even if the person has other simanims. Like I said, Reuven has a birthmark on his right elbow, so that is not enough. That is not enough. It needs facial recognition. So says the Gemara, the Memra to simanim lav daraisa. Shabbos, I guess this means that in general, simanim, right, having a defining sign is not enough midaraisa. In other words, Shabbos say that again, a siman doesn't work midaraisa. Because again, if a siman worked daraisa, then what? Then halacha l'maisa. Whatever Simon had, whatever Reuven had, remember again, by the way, it could be a Simon on his body or Simon on his clothing. Reuven went missing wearing a blue suit with a purple lining. Now, both say you find the body with a blue suit and a purple lining, or Reuven had a birthmark on his right elbow. If you held that Simanim are da'araisa, then this should be enough to identify Reuven. The fact that the Mishnah says that the only thing that works to identify Reuven is facial recognition tells us that what? Simanim don't work midaraisa. Or mini, I'll ask a question. Matzu kasher b'kis uba arneki b'tabas, oshenim ben kelov, afilus mamruba kasher. I will say the Gemara asked an interesting question. A get case. I will say here's the case. Look at Rashi. Matzu kasher hamevi get liisha va'avarimeno. So I'll say here's the case. The case is where, let's say again, Reuven is delivering a get on behalf of Shimon. Reuven is delivering a get. Reuven lost the get, right? Good. Reuven lost the get, right? Now what happens? Sometimes later, Reuven finds the get. Where does he find it? Rashi says, Bein Kalov, Bein Kli Beiso, Umakir Asakis. About say he goes ahead and he finds the get between his utensils. Utensils they know that are his, or ultimately again that's kosher. Or I will say he finds the get with his signet ring. So in other words, he finds the get with the siman that it was with his property the entire time. What's the halacha? The halacha is even if he didn't find it for a long time, the get is kosher. We'll say, what do you see from here? That simanim do work midaraisa. To which the Gemara says, Amar Abaye lo kasher. Harab Elazar ben Ma'avai harabanan. It's a machlokes, two different opinions. This sanya ein me'idin al hashuma. The boss say, listen to this. If a man has a mole, shuma's a mole. Let's say you find the body, right? You find the body. We think it's Reuven's. Reuven's wife tells us he had a mole on his right cheek. So the Gemara says, ein me'idin al hashuma. Presence of a mole is not enough of an identifying feature. Rabbi Elazar ben Ma'avai or Me'idin. Rabbi Elazar says, no, it works. My law, what are they arguing about? One opinion holds that simanim work even da'araisa, and the other opinion says no, they don't. To which the Gemara says no. Amar Rabba, the kuli amal simanim da'araisa. Next, Rabba say first of the wide lines. Rabba says everyone agrees that simanim are da'araisa. Rabba say, by the way, that's true in so many areas of halacha, right? You lose your wallet. I find the wallet, right? Let's assume for a moment again, it doesn't have your license in it, right? Or your credit cards in it. So all it is a wallet with cash. So, right, you give me a siman, right? It's a brown leather wallet and it has a scratch on the inside cover. Okay, I give you back your wallet. Generally, again, or the get case, simanim work midaraisa. So both say if simanim work daraisa, then why isn't it enough when Reuven's wife said he had a mole on his right cheek? Why isn't that enough? To which they want to say something very interesting. Hacha b'shuma mitsuya ben gilo kamiflagi. Then I will say, here's what's interesting. What's interesting is when we deal with simanim that could be more common. In other words, I will say, so literally means simanim for people for the same age. Ben gilo, Rashi says, shenolo b'perak echad ub'mazal echad. So I will say, so the question is, could people of the same age have the same siman? So you could even leave out the age over here. The question is about certain physical marks that can go ahead and be common amongst people. So I say, listen to this. So the Mar Savar Shuma Mitsuya ben Gilo, Umar Savar Eina Mitsuya ben Gilo. So we'll say one says a mole is a common mark, right? A mole is a common thing. So that especially amongst people around the same age. So therefore, again, if Reuven went ahead and had a mole, we'll go with the approach now that everyone agrees, simanim daraisa. Everyone agrees simanim daraisa. Rabbi say, what's the shaila? The shaila just is halacha lemaisa, whether or not a shuma is enough of a siman. The others say, hacha shuma ha'asuya lehishtanos la'achar misa kamiflagi. Oh, Rabbi say, here's the other issue. The other issue is, do we have to be concerned that a siman changes in appearance after death? After death, listen to this. Mar savar asuya lehishtanos. One opinion holds that halacha lemaisa, ultimately, again, a shuma could change. A shuma could change even after death, right? Umar savar eina asuya lehishtanos la'achar misa. The other opinion holds that no, halacha lemaisa, shuma does not change its appearance after death. Vikidamri, others here both say, Vikidamri, Amarava, to call it Alma Simon and Darabanan, everyone holds Simon and Darabanan, Bahacha Beshuma Amadeus, Simin Mufha Kameflagi. Arabah said, this is very interesting. So I will say, here's what's fascinating. We'll say, first approach was everyone agrees that Simanim are Daraisa. So what's the machlokes? The machlokes is in the possible is a mole enough of a defining siman, or for that matter, do we have to be concerned that a mole maybe changes its appearance after death? They both say now an alternate version. The alternate version is no, simanim adirabanan. Simanim adirabanan. So what's the machlokes? The machlokes will say here is whether or not v'hacha b'shuma siman mufa kamiflige. We'll say first line chaf kuf chaf amud beis. We'll say the machlokes over here is ultimately again the presence of a mole, a siman mufhak. Ultimately, again, is it considered to be a siman mufhak? So the Gemara says, we'll say, look at Rashi. Now we'll say, now what's a siman mufhak? A siman mufhak means like an undisputable siman. Then I will say, here's what's fascinating. The Gemara is suggesting, even if you hold that simanim are dirabanan, if something is a siman mufhak, it'll absolutely work. Take a look at Rashi. Biafagav the simanim dirabanan asimin kihai samchinon afilu isodaraisa. But so listen to this. Even if you normally hold that simanim are dirabanan, if something is called a siman mufhak, ultimately, again, one could absolutely rely on it. Pretty amazing. So mar savar siman mufhak, umar savar lav siman mufhak. One will hold that a shuma is a siman mufhak, and one will hold that it's not a siman mufhak. So I will say, so really fascinating. So first of all, we have so much stuff going on over here. A fundamental machlokes are simanim darais or simanim drabanan, right? I will say, which is a mind-blowing machlokes. Then I will say the other question becomes in the world of simanim, what's considered to be a reliable siman or not? And specifically for our case, the shuma, the mole, right? Is the mole considered to be a siman mufhak or not? That's the fundamental shaila. To which the Gemara says, "Ulahach lishna da amarava siman and daraisa." What's this? Go ahead for just a moment. That which we said before, that simanim are daraisa hakatani afa pishiyesh simanim begufo ubekelav. So we'll say. So remember again, we said before. So let's analyze it just a moment. So we'll say, what did our Mishnah say? What type of simanim do you need in order to be able to identify a corpse? What do you need? Facial recognition. Now we've established what's facial recognition: forehead, face, nose. Okay, so let's analyze this just a moment. And the Mishnah explicitly said, even if there are other simanim on the body or on the clothing of the corpse, that does not work. So Gemara says, I don't understand that. According to Rava, according to the version that we had before, that Rava said that simanim are da'oraisa, then ultimately, again, the Mishnah said, so we'll say, so then why wouldn't it work if there are simanim in the body or in his clothing? Right? Why wouldn't that work if simanim are da'oraisa? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you. Gufo da'arech v'gutz. Because we'll say, ultimately, again, simanim in body, the body that's talking about in the Mishnah, is, let's say, again, Reuven was tall or short, and you find a corpse that was tall or short. So I will say, tall or short is not a siman. Is not a siman. As I will say, remember, in the world of simanim, a siman has to be something that what? Has some element of uniqueness. So being tall or short is not a siman. Right? Kelev dechayshina l'she'ela. The Mishnah is fascinating. Furthermore, why would the Mishnah say that finding that clothing is not a good siman? Why not? Because when it comes to clothing, there's always a possibility that's what? That maybe halacha lemaisa, he borrowed clothing. Right? Maybe the clothing that he has ultimately again is not his clothing. So let's listen to this. But here's the problem. If you're choshesh that people borrow stuff, they will say, I'll give you an interesting case. I lose my donkey. One of the ways that you could identify your donkey is how? By identifying the saddle on the donkey. Well, just because I identify the saddle, maybe I went ahead and lent my saddle to someone else. So how could a saddle be an identifying siman? To which the Gemara says, no, everyone knows. Lo shaili insha ukfa. Everyone knows you never lend out your saddle. Why? The maskiv leilachamra. We'll say apparently, when it came to your donkey, a saddle was like a custom thing, right? Because if it wasn't specifically fitted to that donkey, it would scratch, it would cut the donkey. So therefore, again, everyone knows that if you identify the saddle, that's a good siman that it's your donkey. So let's go back for a second. The get case. We'll say, what was the get case? Reuven was the shaliach to go ahead and deliver the get on behalf of Shimon. We'll say Reuven loses the get. He finds the get later on. Let's say, I will say what? Between his utensils, or together with his wallet, or with his signet ring. So what did we say? Halacha l'maisa, Reuven is believed to say, that's the get I lost. And he's believed, but how could that be? And we'll say again, why aren't we concerned that halacha l'maisa, maybe he lent out these items, and therefore the get that he found is not the get that he lost? I'll tell you why. Tabas chayish l'ziyufi. And we'll say people don't lend out their signet rings. Why not? Because they're concerned about forgeries, right? Arniki, we'll say people don't lend out their wallets. In Baltimore City, people lend out their wallet all the time, by the way, we'll say. Right? So the Gemara says as follows, right? So people borrow wallets all the time. So the Gemara says, the Arniki, we'll say, what about Arniki? What about a wallet? So menachashi in shivala moshli. It was interesting. People were superstitious about lending out wallets. Let's say why? Because your wallet represents your wealth. So apparently people are superstitious and they don't lend out their wallets because it looks like you're giving over your wealth to someone. The other possibility is Kelav Bechiyuri Bisumki. Or I will say the other possibility is that ultimately, again, we're talking about, so we'll say, so therefore, again, that's why in the get case, when you find the get that you lost with your signet ring or with your wallet, I will say those are things that people don't lend out. So therefore, if you find the lost get with those items, if you're the shaliach, you could assume that the get you found is what? The get that you lost. The Gemara in Zafi by Ema, Kela Bechir V'Sumke. Well, so the other possibility is when the Mishnah says that you cannot go ahead and use the corpse's clothing or his kalim ultimately as a siman, that's talking about a case where you're identifying the siman by the kalim by what? Their color. I will say, so identifying by color is never a good siman. So I will say, I just want to point out, this is really a fascinating sugya. So first, again, I will say two major machloksim. Number one, are simanim d'oraisa or d'rabanan, right? The ability to go to come with a symbol, with a defining sign. Does that work d'oraisa d'rabanan? I will say, how do we paskin? We paskin simanim work d'oraisa. Simanim work d'oraisa. Now I will say, it's interesting over here that the way the Gemara seems to be setting up, I will say the next machlokes is what's considered to be a defining sign. So that's a whole machlokes. And especially when it comes to a corpse, again, I will say, do we have to be concerned that certain simanim go ahead and change after death as well? Is a mole a siman mufak, not a siman mufak? I will say that's why our Mishnah says the one siman that will always work is facial recognition. Facial recognition as defined by the forehead, the face, the nose. That is an uncontestable siman and will go ahead and work to ascertain or to solidify the identity of the deceased. Other siman, I will say, have to really be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. Clothing sometimes can work, sometimes doesn't work. Birthmarks sometimes can work, sometimes doesn't work. We'll say, of course, contemporarily, DNA, of course, works, right? I will say that's why, again, sometimes, Rahman al-Hassan, you have situations where you can't identify a body by anything other than DNA, dental records, right? Those things which are clearly unique to the individual will absolutely help to ascertain ascertain identity. Amazing. So the Gemara goes weiter. The next part of the Mishnah said, even if you see a guy in a clearly we'll call it what's the right word? Imminent death situation, you cannot testify about his death unless what? You actually saw him dead. So the Gemara says as far as Lememra, the Maguyad Chai. So I'll say one of the examples was you saw a guy Maguyad cut. So we'll say, let's say you see someone pierced with a sword, and again, it's the titan, and not in his leg, through his heart, you see clearly, it's a mortal wound. So we'll say, so again, it's halacha l'maaseh. Now the Mishnah still says you can't testify about his death until you actually see him dead. So remember the maguyad chai. What are we concerned about? Are you concerned that a person who gets stabbed by a sword is going to live? Right, that somebody who has this mortal injury is going to live. Or the Gemara says, Adam eino metame achetetze nafsho. We'll say in general, a person does not convey tumah. A corpse doesn't convey tumah until he's actually dead. So the Gemara says, afilu maguyad va'afilu magoses. Even if someone is stabbed, or even if someone is a goses, right? In other words, on his deathbed. To which the Gemara infers, tamuye lo metame hamichi lo chaye. Now we'll say it's only that he doesn't convey tumah. But there's no shaila that what? That he's going to die. So we'll say, this is a mortal injury. So what are we concerned about over here? So we'll say, so just to play this out, Chas v'shalom, I see Reuven stabbed through the heart with a sword. So I got it. He's not going to convey corpse tuma until he drops dead on the ground. But Lamaisa, there's no way he's surviving that. So halacha Lamaisa again, why can't I testify that he's dead, even if I did not see him dead on the ground? Am Rabbi Lokasha, Rabbi Shimon Elazar harabanon. So machlokas, this sanya, me'idin ala maguyad, ve'in me'idin ala tzalov. You could testify about a guy who was stabbed with a sword or with a spear that he's dead, even if you didn't see him actually die. But you can't go, because we assume such a person automatically dies. But you can't testify about a person who was hanged until you actually see him dead. Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer, af al ha-meguyad. Rabbi Shimon Elazar says you could even testify about the person who was stabbed. I'm sorry. Even about the person who was stabbed, they're both saying, you cannot testify about him until you actually see him dead. Why? What's the possibility? The possibility is someone cauterized the wound. He got stabbed, but maybe the stab wound was immediately cauterized, and maybe he's able to survive. So when it comes to a stab wound, unless you actually see him dead, halacha l'maaseh, you can't testify. So we'll say, now you're telling me therefore that the Mishnah is set up like Rabbi Shimon Elazar, and that's why halacha l'maaseh, the Mishnah says even when a guy looks like he was mortally stabbed, unless you see him dead, you cannot testify. So can we start the Mishnah this way? V'hakatani seifa. Look at the end of the Mishnah. Look at which we'll say this is tomorrow's daf. Ma'isa ba'asya be'echad sheshalishuhu liyam. Listen to this. There was a Maisa in Asya with a guy who they lowered into the sea. V'lo alsa b'yadam ela raglo. Jose is incredible. So they lowered Ruvain, an entire body, into the water. And when they pulled him back out, all they pulled out was a foot. So we'll say, now listen to this. So we'll say, now what's the shaila? Is Ruvain dead or not? Right? Is Ruvain? We know it's definitely missing, right? But Lamaisa, is he dead or not? So we'll say, now watch this. The Chacham say it depends. We'll say if we pulled out not just the foot but a leg, right? A leg above the knee, then I will say we assume that's the type of injury from which a person cannot recover. As we saw this before, that if the leg is severed above the knee, we assume that is a mortal injury, right? Just because a person is going to bleed out from that. That's a mortal injury. And therefore, again, we would allow his wife to remarry. But if we pulled out a leg from below the knee, ultimately, again, that would not allow her to remarry. So I will say, so one second, I don't understand, but based on Shimon Elazar, halacha l'maisa, right? Still, why would we allow her to, even above the knee, why would you allow her to remarry? Maybe the wound was healed. Shiny maya de marzumaka. Salt water is different. Right? They will say, why is water different? Water agitates the wound. So because water agitates the wound, therefore, again, water itself intensifies the injury. And that's why, again, we could assume that if you're pulling out a leg from above the knee, then Allah Chalamai said, this guy is dead. So the Gemara says, the shakal safsira begaidi legamle v'la afsekise lenaaruse. So Rabbi Barachana said, I once saw an Arab merchant, who took his sword, lopped off the leg of his camel above the knee, and the camel didn't even go ahead and finish its braying, or whatever a camel does, braying, neighing, right? Didn't even finish its bray, its neigh, until it dropped dead. So I would say, see from here that a certain traumatic injuries have the ability to cause a person to die. So therefore, I will say, Rav Shimon Elazar, how can you say that halacha l'maisa, a person could potentially survive being stabbed, especially in a vital organ? Amar Abaye, hahi kechi shahavya. That was a weak camel. That's why it died so quickly. Okay. Rava Amarava says, Bisakin milubenes v'divrei akol. So we'll say this is quite fascinating. So Abaye says, it depends. We'll listen to this. What's the type of mortal injury that we say that a person potentially could survive from? We'll listen to this, where a person was stabbed with a burning hot sword. I will say, now what's interesting about this? On one hand, it's the mortal injury, and also what instantaneously cauterizes. So I will say, so this is the interesting case where you could have a mortal injury, but instant cauterization. I don't know if that's the word, cauterization. I will say, so again, the point over that the Gemara is making is, that's why the Mishnah comes along and says, you can't testify that someone is dead just based on the fact that you saw a traumatic injury, or that you saw a life-threatening situation occur. Halacha l'maisa, in order to testify, you have to see what you have to, the guy is mamish dead. So the Gemara goes right. So let's listen to this. Amar Rabbi Shmuel, lo shana makom ela she'ein nafsha yotza, aval makom she'nafsha yotza mi'idin. So I will say, Rabbi Shmuel said as follows. He said that halacha l'maisa, when do we say that even if a person was being eaten by an animal, or for that matter, stabbed, that you can't testify about the individual that he's dead unless you see him dead? That's only if the injury wasn't happening in a vital organ. In other words, say, chas v'shalom, you see a person getting eaten by an animal by his throat. Apologize for the graphic nature, but you see that again, it's clearly happening in a way where there is no chance of survival. There's no chance of survival. So ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa makom shenafshe yotze me'idin. So I will say, so therefore, again, Rabbi Yehuda said, name of Shmuel, if you see the injury happening in a vital organ in a way that there is no way you could survive, even if you don't see him dead on the ground, you can testify about this individual. But Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel, so let's listen to this. Is that true? Listen to the following case. Shachat bo shnayim v'rov shnayim ubarach me'idin. So let's listen to this case. Let's say you see a guy who had his two simanim, or the majority of his two simanim cut, windpipe and trachea, right? Windpipe and his trachea cut. They were slit. Yet Rabbi say the guy is running away. He's running away, so he's moving, which I will say is possible, right? Absolutely possible, right? I will say, so again, halacha l'maisa, you can testify that he's dead. You can testify that he's dead and allow his wife to remarry. Is that so? I will say, so here's an example, even though I don't see the guy lying on the ground dead. But one thing I know, which is what I will say, if a person has his windpipe and trachea cut, he's not surviving that. He's going to die. Even though now he's running away, right? Lamaisa, I could testify that he's dead. And I could testify that he said and allow his wife to remarry. So the Gemara says, is that true, Ini? V'amar Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Shachat bo shnayim o rov shnayim, v'ramaz v'amar kisu get le'ishti, hare elu yichtavu v'yitnu. But say this is pretty wild. Let's say a guy has his trachea and windpipe slit. Rabbi say he motions to write a get for his wife. Now, why is he motioning to write a get for his wife? The pashto, so we'll say it's Yevamos. He doesn't want his wife to have to do yibum. So we'll say, what's the halacha? We can do it. We could write that get and deliver it on his behalf. So we'll say, what does that show you? What does that show you? That he's alive. To which the Gemara says, yes, I understand that. Chayhu b'sof olamos. I will say, I'm not denying the fact that Allah in this moment now, he's alive. But what do I know? What do I know? He is going to die. That's what I know. He is going to die. Ella. So the Gemara says, Ella me'ata yegola al yado. If that's the case, then halacha lemaisa again. Halacha lemaisa. I should be sent to Galus, right? As a result. And so we'll say, we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up with this last case tomorrow. But we'll say again, fasting. So again, I just want to point out what you do begin to see, Rabbi say, is what? What you do begin to see is halacha lemaisa. As much as the Mishnah said unequivocally that in order to testify about someone, you have to see them dead. What we begin to see is certain situations where what? Where halacha lemaisa, there is no chance of survival. Seeing a person in that state may in fact be enough to allow you to testify that they are indeed dead. We'll finish up this last case of Shachar Boshnayim tomorrow. Bosai, Shkoyach.